The year is 1453, and Constantinople has fallen. But this story isn't about the conquest of a city or the end of an empire. It's about something far more sinister, something that historians have deliberately buried for over 5 centuries. What I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you thought you knew about Ottoman tolerance and Islamic civilization. Picture this. You're a young woman who has devoted your life to God. You've taken sacred vows, renounced worldly pleasures, and dedicated yourself to prayer, education, and serving your community. Your days begin before dawn with hymns echoing through stone corridors. Your nights end with quiet contemplation and scripture. This is your world, your calling, your identity. Now imagine that in less than 5 minutes, all of that will be stripped away through methods so calculated and brutal that even hardened military historians struggle to document them without psychological trauma. The systematic targeting of Christian nuns under Ottoman rule represents one of history's most deliberately concealed atrocities. While scholars have extensively studied the empire's military campaigns and administrative policies, the focused persecution of religious women has remained locked away in diplomatic archives and missionary reports that most people will never see. But today, we're going to unlock those archives and expose the machinery of horror that the Ottoman Empire built specifically to destroy the spiritual backbone of Christian communities. Between 1453 and 1924, the Christian population of Asia Minor collapsed from 20% to just 2%. That's not migration statistics or natural demographic change. That's systematic erasure, planned and executed across multiple generations of Ottoman rulers. And at the center of this genocide were policies specifically designed to target the women who represented the moral and educational foundation of Christian society. The numbers alone tell a horrifying story. During this period, 11 ecumenical patriarchs of Constantinople were executed, along with nearly 100 bishops and thousands of priests and monks. But these religious leaders weren't the primary targets of the empire's most sadistic policies. That distinction belonged to the nuns, the teachers, the healers, the women who had sacrificed everything for their faith. Their suffering served a dual purpose: to shatter Christian communities psychologically, while simultaneously feeding an economic system built on human trafficking. What makes this even more disturbing is how methodically it was organized. This wasn't random violence or the chaotic brutality of warfare. The Ottoman Empire developed a legal framework, a bureaucratic structure, and specialized facilities specifically designed to process Christian religious women like industrial commodities. Under Islamic law, as interpreted by Ottoman jurists, Christians were classified as dhimmi, second-class subjects with severely limited rights. In Ottoman courts, the testimony of a Christian woman carried less legal weight than that of a Muslim man, and crimes against them, particularly against nuns, went virtually unpunished. European diplomatic records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain a chilling admission. There is no documented case of a Muslim being prosecuted for raping, abducting, or enslaving a Christian woman between 1894 and 1924. 0 cases. This wasn't oversight or judicial corruption. This was policy. The targeting of nuns wasn't merely about cruelty or satisfying the appetites of soldiers. It was strategic warfare conducted with scientific precision. These women were the backbone of Christian education, the keepers of religious traditions, the moral guides for entire communities. Breaking them meant breaking the spiritual resistance of conquered populations. Their public degradation sent a message that resonated through every Christian household. If God's most devoted servants could not be protected, what hope did ordinary believers have? The process began long before soldiers ever set foot in a monastery. Ottoman administrators maintained detailed intelligence files on Christian religious institutions across their territories. These records included the number of nuns in each convent, their ages, their educational backgrounds, even inventories of their material possessions. This information was used to plan attacks designed for maximum psychological impact and financial return. When the raids came, they followed established protocols that had been refined over centuries. The targeted convent would be completely surrounded to prevent any escape. Buildings were systematically searched for valuables and hidden passages. The nuns were gathered in a central location and sorted according to age and perceived usefulness. Those deemed too old for labor or reproduction were often executed immediately. But the younger women faced something far worse than death. The destruction of identity began before the physical abuse. Religious habits were torn away and burned. Heads were shaved to remove any trace of their former appearance. Christian names were replaced with Turkish ones assigned by their captors. They were forced through conversion ceremonies that combined Islamic religious instruction with calculated sexual violence designed to break their spirit completely. In major Ottoman cities, specialized processing centers were established to handle the systematic conversion and trafficking of captured Christian women. These facilities operated with the same bureaucratic efficiency as tax collection offices or military supply depots. Each building contained examination rooms where captives were inspected, measured, and assigned monetary values based on their age, health, and perceived attractiveness. Their futures were determined by cold calculations about how they could best serve the empire's needs. The most horrifying aspect of this system was the deliberate use of reproductive violence as a tool of genocide. Captured nuns were systematically impregnated to produce children who would inherit slave status under Islamic law. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of human bondage that required no new military campaigns to maintain. The empire had discovered how to manufacture its own supply of enslaved Christians. Medical manuals from this period describe in clinical detail how to maintain the health of pregnant captives, treating them like livestock breeding stock rather than human beings. Physicians were assigned to these facilities not to provide compassionate care, but to maximize birth rates, while keeping the mothers alive for repeated use. The children born from these forced unions were separated from their mothers immediately and classified according to their potential value to the state. Boys who appeared strong or intelligent were taken for military training, destined for the Janissary Corps or other imperial services. They would be raised as Muslims with no knowledge of their Christian heritage, turned into weapons against their own people. Girls were sorted based on their physical appearance and health. Some were designated as future breeding stock, others assigned to domestic servitude in wealthy households. The psychological warfare embedded in this system was devastatingly effective. The public humiliation of nuns became a weapon of terror that often eliminated the need for actual military conquest. Villages that witnessed such atrocities frequently surrendered without resistance the next time Ottoman forces appeared on the horizon. The empire's reputation for targeting religious women spread faster than its armies, creating zones of submission through fear alone. But this was only the beginning. The true scope of Ottoman brutality toward Christian nuns goes far beyond what I've described so far. In the next part of this investigation, we'll examine the specialized facilities where these women were held, the economic networks that profited from their suffering, and the legal codes that transformed sexual violence into state policy. We'll also uncover the archaeological evidence that proves this systematic horror continued for centuries, and explore why this history has been deliberately buried by modern historians who prefer comfortable myths about Ottoman tolerance. The story of what happened to Christian nuns under Ottoman rule isn't just historical tragedy. It's a warning about how quickly civilization can collapse when human beings are redefined as commodities, and how bureaucratic efficiency can transform individual cruelty into industrial-scale atrocity. The infrastructure of this systematic horror was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Ottoman engineers designed specialized buildings across the empire specifically for processing human beings. These weren't crude dungeons or improvised holding cells. They were purpose-built facilities with architectural features that reveal their sinister function. Narrow chambers with reinforced walls, complex drainage systems, and restraint fixtures embedded directly into the stonework. Archaeological excavations in cities like Bursa and Adrianople have uncovered the remains of these processing centers, and what researchers found defies comprehension. The buildings contained multiple levels connected by hidden staircases, allowing for the efficient movement of captives without public visibility. Ventilation systems were carefully engineered, not for comfort, but to prevent death by suffocation during mass confinement. Every architectural detail served the dual purpose of maximizing capacity while maintaining operational secrecy. The economic machinery that drove this system was equally methodical. Captured nuns commanded premium prices in Ottoman slave markets, precisely because of their perceived purity and educational background. Their literacy made them valuable as tutors and administrators in wealthy households. Their religious training was seen as evidence of discipline and moral character, ironically making them more desirable to buyers seeking both servants and status symbols. Market records from Constantinople and other major trading centers document the pricing structures that governed these transactions. A young educated nun could sell for 3 times the price of a rural peasant woman. Age, health, language skills, and physical appearance all factored into complex valuation formulas that treated human souls like commodities in a marketplace. The empire's merchants developed expertise in human appraisal that rivaled their knowledge of silk or spices. This economic incentive created a feedback loop that perpetuated the violence. Successful raids generated substantial profits, which funded larger military operations, which captured more women, which generated more revenue. The systematic abuse of Christian nuns became a self-sustaining industry that required minimal imperial investment while producing maximum returns. But the true genius of Ottoman cruelty lay not just in the physical systems they created, but in the psychological warfare they perfected. The empire understood that breaking a person's spirit was more valuable than simply breaking their body. Dead captives had no economic value and created martyrs who could inspire resistance. Living captives who had been completely psychologically destroyed, however, became walking advertisements for Ottoman power. The conversion ceremonies forced upon captured nuns were designed as theatre as much as religious instruction. These events took place in public squares, where local populations could witness the systematic humiliation of women who had once represented moral authority. The nuns were compelled to renounce their vows before crowds of onlookers, to spit upon crosses, and to burn their own prayer books and religious texts. Those who initially refused were subjected to escalating forms of torture, but never killed outright. The goal was submission, not martyrdom. Techniques included sleep deprivation, starvation, and exposure to extreme temperatures. But the most effective method was psychological manipulation, through the exploitation of maternal instincts. Pregnant captives were told their children would be killed unless they cooperated. Mothers who had given birth were shown their infants being taken away, with the promise that conversion might allow eventual reunion. The forced breeding programs that operated within these facilities represent perhaps the most calculated aspect of Ottoman genocide. Women were housed in specialized quarters where their only function was reproduction. Ottoman physicians developed detailed protocols for maintaining pregnancy rates while minimizing mortality among the breeding stock. These medical practices were documented in clinical texts that discussed human reproduction with the same dispassionate terminology used for livestock management. The children born into this system inherited their mother's slave status automatically under Ottoman interpretation of Islamic law. But their fate was determined by gender and perceived capability. Male children showing signs of intelligence or physical strength were removed from their mothers within weeks of birth and transported to training facilities where they would be molded into imperial servants or soldiers. Female children faced a more complex sorting process. Those deemed physically attractive were often designated for future concubinage in elite households. Others were assigned to domestic service or in some cases, reserved for the breeding programs themselves once they reached reproductive age. The most disturbing aspect of this system was how it created generational cycles of abuse that could theoretically continue indefinitely without requiring new military conquests. Transportation networks were developed specifically to move human cargo efficiently across the empire's vast territories. Ships were modified with specialized compartments designed to maximize capacity while preventing escape or suicide. Land routes included designated stopping points where captives could be held temporarily during long journeys. At each stage of transport, detailed records were maintained documenting the number of captives, their condition, and their ultimate destination. The legal framework supporting this machinery of horror was equally comprehensive. Ottoman courts operated under interpretations of Islamic law that classified Christian captives as legitimate spoils of war regardless of their civilian status. The rape of captured women was not considered a criminal act, but rather an exercise of property rights granted by conquest. Legal scholars produced extensive theological justifications for these practices, arguing that the sexual domination of Christian women represented divine approval of Islamic victory over infidelity. These legal codes created a system where violence against Christian nuns was not only permitted, but actively encouraged as a demonstration of religious superiority. Court records from this period contain hundreds of cases where Muslim men claimed ownership of Christian women based solely on their participation in raids or military campaigns. The legal system consistently upheld these claims while dismissing any testimony from the women themselves. The bureaucratic apparatus that administered this system reveals how thoroughly it was integrated into the empire's normal governmental functions. The same officials who managed tax collection and military logistics also oversaw human trafficking operations. Specialized clerks maintained inventories of captured women using the same record-keeping methods applied to grain supplies or military equipment. In these ledgers, Christian nuns appear alongside lists of livestock and manufactured goods, reduced to entries in an imperial accounting system. Regional administrators were evaluated partly on their efficiency in processing captured Christians and generating revenue from their sale or exploitation. Promotion within the imperial bureaucracy could depend on demonstrating innovation in methods for extracting maximum value from human captives. The systematic brutalization of Christian nuns became a pathway to career advancement within the Ottoman state structure. The scale of this operation required coordination between multiple levels of government and society. Local militia groups conducted raids to capture women for sale to imperial officials. Professional slave traders developed expertise in evaluating and transporting human cargo. Wealthy households created demand by purchasing educated Christian women as servants and concubines. Religious authorities provided theological justification for practices that violated basic human dignity. Every sector of Ottoman society participated in or profited from this machinery of horror. Modern archaeological evidence continues to reveal the physical infrastructure that supported these operations. Recent excavations have uncovered restraint devices, modified drainage systems, and specialized architectural features in buildings across former Ottoman territories. Chemical analysis of ancient mortar and stone reveals traces of human remains in locations where historical records indicated processing facilities once operated. Perhaps most disturbing is how this systematic horror was normalized within Ottoman culture. Contemporary accounts from European travelers and diplomats describe the open sale of Christian women in major markets as routine commercial activity. The degradation of captured nuns was discussed in official correspondence, with the same casual tone used for reporting crop yields or military expenses. This normalization extended to the highest levels of Ottoman society. Sultans and their courts regularly received gifts of captured Christian women, including nuns whose forced conversion had been personally supervised by provincial governors. These presentations were ceremonial occasions, celebrated as demonstrations of imperial power and religious triumph. The normalization of this horror created a culture where witnessing the degradation of Christian women became a form of entertainment for Ottoman society. Public auctions were scheduled like festivals, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who gathered to watch captured nuns being sold like livestock. These events served multiple purposes beyond mere commerce. They reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating the powerlessness of conquered Christians, while providing the Muslim population with tangible proof of their religion's supposed superiority. The psychological conditioning required to sustain such a system reveals the depth of cultural transformation that occurred within Ottoman society. Entire generations grew up viewing the sexual exploitation of Christian women as normal and even praiseworthy. Children learned to associate the suffering of captured nuns with divine blessing and imperial strength. This conditioning was so thorough that many participants genuinely believed they were performing righteous acts blessed by God. The empire's educational system played a crucial role in perpetuating these attitudes. Islamic schools taught that the domination of Christian women represented Allah's will being fulfilled on earth. Young men were instructed that participation in raids against monasteries and convents was a form of holy war that would earn them spiritual rewards in the afterlife. The curriculum deliberately fostered contempt for Christian religious practices while glorifying their destruction. Military training incorporated specific instruction on the capture and processing of Christian women. Soldiers learned techniques for surrounding monasteries without allowing escape, methods for evaluating captives according to their potential value, and procedures for transporting human cargo without significant loss. These skills were considered as essential as swordsmanship or horsemanship for Ottoman warriors. The breeding compounds that operated throughout the empire represented the ultimate expression of this systematized cruelty. These facilities were designed with the same attention to efficiency found in the empire's most advanced manufacturing centers. Architects planned optimal layouts for housing maximum numbers of women, while minimizing the resources required for their maintenance. Engineers developed feeding systems that provided just enough nutrition to sustain pregnancy without wasting imperial funds on unnecessary comfort. The medical oversight of these breeding programs reveals how completely the empire had abandoned any pretense of human dignity. Physicians assigned to the facilities kept detailed records of menstrual cycles, pregnancy rates, and birth outcomes. They developed techniques for maximizing conception while minimizing complications that might reduce the productive capacity of their human livestock. Treatment protocols focused exclusively on maintaining the women's ability to reproduce, with no consideration for their physical comfort or psychological well-being. The separation of mothers from their newborn children was conducted according to strict schedules designed to prevent emotional bonding that might interfere with the system's efficiency. Infants were removed within hours of birth and transported to specialized nurseries where their future roles would be determined through systematic evaluation. Those designated for military service received different nutrition and care than those assigned to domestic work or future breeding programs. The transportation networks that moved these children across the empire operated with the same logistical precision as military supply chains. Specialized vehicles were designed to carry large numbers of infants safely across long distances. Feeding stations were established at regular intervals along major routes to ensure survival rates remained high enough to justify the operational costs. The training facilities where these children were processed into imperial servants represented another level of the system's sophisticated brutality. Young boys were subjected to intensive physical conditioning and Islamic indoctrination designed to erase any memory of their Christian heritage. They were taught to view their birth mothers as enemies of the faith who had corrupted them before their salvation through capture. Female children faced different, equally systematic but conditioning. Those selected for domestic service learned household skills while being constantly reminded of their inferior status as former Christians. Those designated for future breeding programs received instruction in submission and obedience that began in early childhood. The empire understood that breaking people was most effective when started young, before independent thought could fully develop. The economic calculations that drove these child processing operations were documented with the same precision as other imperial industries. Officials tracked the costs of feeding, housing, and training, captured children against their projected lifetime value as slaves or soldiers. Detailed projections estimated the return on investment for different categories of children over periods spanning decades. Regional variations in these systems reveal how thoroughly the empire had adapted its brutality to local conditions. In mountainous areas, facilities were built into natural cave systems that provided concealment and security. In coastal regions, underground chambers connected to harbor facilities allowed for efficient transfer of human cargo to ships. Desert provinces developed specialized techniques for maintaining captives in extreme climates while preserving their market value. The diplomatic correspondence between Ottoman officials and European governments during this period contains chilling evidence of how normalized this systematic horror had become. Ambassadors discussed the capture and sale of Christian women with the same bureaucratic language used for trade negotiations or border disputes. European powers, despite their knowledge of these atrocities, often chose to maintain diplomatic relations rather than confront the empire's practices directly. This complicity extended to commercial relationships that indirectly supported the trafficking operations. European merchants purchased goods produced by enslaved Christian women while choosing to ignore the conditions under which those products were manufactured. Banking systems facilitated financial transactions that funded the expansion of processing facilities and transportation networks. The technological innovations developed to support these operations demonstrate the empire's commitment to maximizing efficiency in human exploitation. Specialized restraint devices were manufactured by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their ability to prevent escape while minimizing damage that might reduce market value. Communication systems using coded signals allowed officials to coordinate raids and transfers across vast distances without alerting potential victims. The legal precedents established during this period created frameworks that would influence Ottoman policy for centuries. Court decisions consistently upheld the principle that Christian captives, regardless of their previous status as religious figures, possessed no rights that Muslim owners were bound to respect. These rulings were compiled into legal texts that guided future generations of Ottoman jurists in maintaining the system's theoretical justifications. The integration of this systematic brutality into Ottoman religious practice reveals how completely the empire had perverted spiritual concepts to justify material cruelty. Prayers were composed thanking Allah for delivering Christian women into Muslim hands. Religious festivals included ceremonial presentations of newly captured nuns as offerings to demonstrate the faithful's devotion. The mosque became a venue for celebrating atrocities that violated every principle of human compassion. The cultural artifacts produced during this era reflect how deeply these practices had penetrated Ottoman society. Poems celebrated the capture of Christian women as romantic conquests blessed by divine will. Artwork depicted the forced conversion of nuns as spiritual victories worthy of commemoration. Musical compositions were written to accompany public auctions and conversion ceremonies, transforming human suffering into entertainment. The psychological impact on surviving Christian communities extended far beyond the immediate victims of these policies. Entire populations lived in constant terror of raids that could destroy their families' communities overnight. Parents taught their daughters to hide their beauty and intelligence to avoid attracting the attention of Ottoman slavers. Young women abandoned plans for religious vocations rather than risk the fate that awaited captured nuns. The empire's intelligence networks that supported these operations were equally sophisticated, employing local informants who reported on Christian religious activities and identified potential targets for future raids. These collaborators were rewarded with shares of the profits from successful captures, creating economic incentives for betraying their own communities. The documentation of these intelligence operations reveals a web of betrayal that stretched across every level of Christian society. Informants were recruited from among desperate peasants who traded information for food, from merchants who chose profit over conscience, and even from within Christian clergy who believed collaboration might protect their own congregations. These networks of human surveillance created an atmosphere where no Christian community could feel truly safe. The empire developed sophisticated methods for identifying the most valuable targets within Christian populations. Scouts were trained to recognize signs of education, religious devotion, and social influence among young women. They learned to distinguish between ordinary peasant girls and those who possessed the literacy and refinement that commanded premium prices in slave markets. Detailed reports were compiled describing individual nuns by name, documenting their skills, their family connections, and their potential resistance to conversion. The timing of raids was calculated with mathematical precision to maximize both psychological impact and operational success. Attacks typically occurred during major Christian holy days when entire communities would be gathered for worship, making it impossible for potential victims to scatter and hide. The empire's military planners understood that striking during sacred moments would create trauma that extended far beyond the immediate violence. The seasonal patterns of these operations followed the agricultural calendar and trade routes that connected the empire's territories. Spring raids coincided with the movement of merchant caravans that could transport captured women to distant markets before local authorities could organize rescue attempts. Summer campaigns targeted mountain monasteries, when weather conditions made escape through difficult terrain nearly impossible. Winter operations focused on isolated convents where communities had stockpiled food and resources that could sustain both captives and captors during long sieges. The specialized equipment developed for these operations included modified wagons designed to prevent escape while maintaining the appearance of normal commercial transport. False bottoms concealed human cargo beneath legitimate merchandise, allowing trafficking operations to move openly along major trade routes without attracting unwanted attention from European observers or rival Ottoman officials who might demand shares of the profits. The training protocols for personnel involved in these operations were as rigorous as those for elite military units. Guards learned techniques for psychological manipulation that could break resistance without causing physical damage that might reduce market value. Handlers developed expertise in managing large groups of captives during transport, using combinations of fear, exhaustion, and false hope to maintain control without requiring excessive force. The medical knowledge applied in these facilities advanced beyond basic reproduction management to include primitive forms of psychological conditioning. Physicians experimented with substances that could induce compliance and memory loss, testing various compounds on captive populations to determine optimal dosages for different desired effects. These protopharmaceutical experiments were documented in clinical journals that treated human subjects as laboratory materials rather than conscious beings. The architectural evolution of processing facilities reflected centuries of refinement in the empire's approach to human exploitation. Later designs incorporated innovations learned from earlier operations, including improved ventilation systems that could handle larger populations, more efficient layouts that reduced the manpower required for supervision, and concealed entrances that allowed operations to continue even in areas under European diplomatic observation. The financial instruments developed to support this industry included specialized banking arrangements that could handle the unique challenges of human commodity trading. Credit systems allowed provincial governors to finance raids against Christian communities with the understanding that captured women would serve as collateral for the loans. Insurance policies protected investors against losses due to escape, death, or diplomatic intervention that might disrupt profitable operations. The cultural transformation required to sustain such systematic brutality manifested in language itself. Ottoman Turkish developed specialized vocabulary for discussing human trafficking with clinical detachment. Terms emerged that distinguished between different categories of captives based on their origin, condition, and intended use. This linguistic evolution reflected how completely the empire had integrated slavery into its conceptual framework for understanding the world. The archives remain sealed in Istanbul, in Vienna, in Moscow, waiting for historians willing to confront what they reveal. Over 2 million Christians vanished from Asia Minor between 1453 and 1924. Their monasteries turned to dust, their children absorbed into a machine built on systematic cruelty. This wasn't ancient barbarism or medieval chaos. This was organized, calculated genocide disguised as religious victory. Until we face these buried truths, silence itself becomes complicity in history's most deliberate lie.